Okay. Hi, everyone. So the title of the article that I chose to do today is Bicultural Identity Integration, BII, Components and Psychosocial Antecedents. This paper was written in 2005 and published in the Journal of Personality, and it was written by two very prominent researchers in the field, Veronica Benet-Martinez and Harry Tados. And this really has a lot to do with my senior research. I'm just generally understanding how it is that biculturals come to understand their different identities, and then this specifically goes into how a bicultural will integrate two different identities, either high integration in both, low integration, preference for one or the other. That's really what the point of this paper is. So I'm going to give just a very general background. Biculturalism is more common in the United States than one would think, yet it's very highly under-researched. According to the U.S. Census in 2000, 1 in 4 individuals in the U.S. has lived in another country before moving to the U.S. and has presumably internalized more than one culture. It's a highly individual process. Finney in 1999, also another prominent researcher, says that increasing numbers of people find that the cultural conflicts are not between different groups, but between different cultural values, attitudes, and expectations within themselves. And lastly, it can be complicated. Bicultural individuals often talk about their dual cultural heritage in complicated ways, both positive and negative, and that's the author of this paper. All right. So the goals of the study are to explore and organize individual variations in the experience of biculturalism, specifically by assessing the potential relationship between personality and acculturation, and I'll define those in a minute, and the effect it has on individuals' levels of bicultural identity and integration. And then the second goal was to create a novel way of understanding high levels of bicultural identity integration and low levels of bicultural identity integration, kind of by redefining the concepts. Let's see how much this cuts off. Okay, so personality, the way that personality is seen in this study is just the basic Big Five model, which we all, I'm sure, know about. There's openness, which is kind of just open to trying new things, etc. Conscientiousness, hardworking, dependable. Extroversion, just outgoing, wanting to be social. Agreeableness, being helpful, trusting. And then neuroticism, which is being prone to negative thoughts. Okay. Acculturation. Before I define acculturation, I'll say really quickly that second culture acquisition is taking in or understanding a new culture. And acculturation is one of these many types of second culture acquisitions. Specifically, what defines acculturation compared to other forms of second culture acquisition is the assumption of hierarchical relationships between cultures. So generally, the culture that a person leaves will be the minority or the ethnic culture, and then the culture that someone goes into is the dominant culture. And then also an individual, while becoming a member of the dominant culture, specific to acculturation is the idea that you don't forget your ethnic culture. You're still highly identified with it. Bicultural identity integration, the definition is, it's a bicultural framework created by Benet-Martinez, who wrote this paper, and it attempts to understand how people integrate their multiple identities with a focus on subjective perception. So it's a very individual process. It's a framework that really focuses on subjective individuals. Right now it has two levels, so people high on BII have high compatibility between their two individual identity. So for example, a Chinese American that is high on BII will feel that the Chinese and the American part of their identity combine very well. Compared to someone who's low on BII, that means that there's low compatibility, difficulty making one cohesive identity. This can lead to problems with like an internal conflict and a need to pick just one. And these are very dichotomous categories. I'll go into that a little bit later. Okay, so recap really quick. The goals of the study are to assess the relationship between personality and acculturation on bicultural identity integration, and to reconceptualize the ideas of having high BII and low BII. So the method was a path analysis / correlational survey methodology, the independent variables being personality and acculturation, and the dependent variable being bicultural identity integration. The participants were 133 first-year Chinese American, either professors or students in an upper Midwestern university in the United States. And the criteria was that they had to have been born in a Chinese country like Malaysia or China, had lived there for at least 5 years, moved to the United States, lived here for at least 5 years, and self-defined themselves as biculturals. So these are the measures that I looked at. They're a little cut off, but I know what they are. So there are the antecedents of bicultural identity integration, and those are the two columns on the left. And then there's the components of bicultural identity integration that's on the right. So the antecedents, those are personality and acculturation being the first two columns, like I mentioned earlier. And then the last column would be the actual components of bicultural identity integration. So personality, I already mentioned that, that's the big five. And then acculturation, there's three main measures that were looked at. The first was done with the Riverside Acculturation Stressor Inventory, and those are possible stressors that can come as a result of acculturation. Work as a stressor would be immigrants' stress as a result of feeling that they have to work more than non-immigrants. Linguistics, stressors related to communication, so for example, accents. Intercultural relations, stress as a result of belonging to two cultures. Discrimination, being discriminated against for the identity that one picks. And then cultural isolation, the stress that comes with feeling that you live in a non-diverse environment. The next one is the acculturation attitudes. These were developed by Barry in 1989, who's also very prominent in this field. And he says that there's 4 kinds of acculturation. I'm only going to go into the second one because it's one that was significant in the path analysis. And the way that these different forms of acculturation differ is the level of identity given to either the ethnic culture or the dominant culture. And here specifically in separation, there's high identity only with the ethnic culture, so with the one that was left. And then lastly, bicultural competence. This is an idea by Laframboise in 1993, and he states that people with high cultural competence feel equally strong and equally involved in both cultures, both in how they identify and in how they behave. And then someone with low cultural competence is someone who is more involved in one culture than another. And then those are all the independent variables. The 2 dependent variables, these are important, are cultural distance and cultural conflict. And this is kind of Benet Martinez's way of reconceptualizing the idea of high BII and low BII. So cultural distance is where the cultures are seen as 2 separate things. So they're not cohesive, they are seen as 2 completely different entities. Whereas cultural conflict is this feeling of being torn between the 2 cultures, where you feel that you need to pick one over the other. Okay, so this is the path analysis. It's a lot, but it's really not. I'll guide you through it. So there's 4 parts to this path analysis. There's the categories on the left, those are personality. In the middle are the acculturation stressors. Down at the bottom are the acculturation orientations, and those are the 3 independent variables. And then on the right are the dependent variables, the cultural conflict and cultural distance. And you'll notice that there are standardized regression coefficients. All of them are significant at 0.05 or lower. And then there's parentheses on the right, and you'll notice that those are the coefficients obtained when personality is not in the model, making it as though personality moderates the relationship between acculturation and bicultural identity integration. The colored lines are direct effects on the outcome itself. So when the measures are going directly to the outcome, it is a colored line. And then the root mean score of approximation is 0.065. That's fairly good in terms of how well this model compares to the hypothesized model. I'm going to go over really quickly just like the correlations, the direct correlations. So for example, the first blue line there, there's a positive relationship as neuroticism increases, cultural conflict increases. As discrimination against an ethnicity increases, so does cultural conflict. Intercultural stress, as that increases, cultural conflict increases. And linguistics, lack of communication with a dominant culture, as that increases, cultural conflict increases. And then for cultural distance, linguistics also increases with cultural distance, but to a lesser degree. Openness, as openness increases, there's a negative relationship here, cultural distance decreases. Cultural isolation, the more isolated you feel, the more culturally distant you feel your 2 identities are. Separation strategy, if you only identify with your ethnic culture, positive relationship there with cultural distance. And then lastly, bicultural competence, strong relationship here. The more biculturally competent you feel, the less distant your 2 identities are. So that kind of checked off goal number 1, which was understand this relationship. We saw here that personality and acculturation do affect BII, with personality moderating the relationship between acculturation and BII. And then, so the takeaway message, distance and conflict are associated with different variables. I don't know if you noticed, but conflict tended to have more associations with things associated with social factors. So like discrimination and intercultural relations. Those are more social components of bicultural identity, which suggests that conflict might be more of a social issue, like being rejected or pressured. That can increase levels of conflict between two identities, and neuroticism increases this. And then lastly, for distance, the main association here tended to be more of an individual thing, so more of an individual thought process, feelings of isolation, feelings of competency, feelings of identity towards one or the other, and that suggests that distance is much more of an individual process. So what happens as a result here, there was a change to the bicultural identity integration model. Originally the model was that high BII, however it is, however we get there, leads to low distance and low conflict. And low BII leads to high distance and high conflict. So the model was actually swapped. So now any combination of conflict and distance leads to differing levels of BII, not strictly high or low. And this kind of checks off the second goal, which was to reconceptualize high and low as not so black and white. And the reason that there can be any combination of conflict and distance is, like I said, these are two independent psychological constructs. They're actually not correlated in any way. So an individual can be very high, have very high levels of distance between their identities and very low levels of conflict, for example. They are not related. And that's because they just both tend to be correlated with different things like stressors, attitudes, personalities, and levels of competency. And I'll leave you guys with this quote. This was one of the participants in the study, and she says, "Biculturalism seems to me to be a dichotomy and a paradox. You are both cultures, and at the same time, you are neither." Thank you.
Any questions or comments?
Oops.